The man cleaning your floors understands China better than your executives. The sentence landed in the room like a sudden crack of thunder on a clear afternoon. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. For a moment, even the quiet hum of the ceiling vents seemed to disappear. At the far end of the 42nd floor conference room, billionaire investor Zhang Guowei slowly pushed the thick contract away from him. The polished walnut table reflected the Manhattan skyline stretching beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, but no one was looking at the view anymore. Every eye was fixed on the Chinese billionaire. Richard Sterling, CEO of Sterling Dynamics, forced a smile that looked more strained by the second. The deal sitting on the table was worth nearly $2 billion. Months of negotiations, international travel, endless presentations, hundreds of employees depending on its success. Yet now everything felt dangerously fragile. Mr. Zhang, Richard said carefully, adjusting the cuff of his tailored navy suit. Perhaps there has been a misunderstanding. Zhang didn't answer. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the back corner of the room, toward someone nobody else had noticed. A man standing beside a cleaning cart. A man holding a microfiber cloth. A man wearing a gray janitor's uniform. Elijah Carter. For a second, Elijah thought Zhang was looking past him. He lowered his eyes and continued wiping fingerprints from a glass partition. It was easier that way. Easier to remain invisible. Invisible people rarely attracted trouble. Around the conference table, executives exchanged confused glances. Several checked their phones. One senior vice president quietly whispered to another. Nobody understood why the billionaire had suddenly stopped the meeting. Nobody understood why he was staring at a janitor. Sunlight poured through the windows and cast long golden reflections across the marble floor. Elijah moved his cleaning cloth in slow circles, pretending not to notice the attention. His posture remained calm, his face unreadable. Yet beneath the surface, his pulse had begun to quicken. Because unlike everyone else in the room, Elijah had understood every word Zhang had spoken moments earlier. Every single one. The billionaire's statement had not been made in English. It had been delivered in fluent Mandarin. Fast, sharp, deliberate. And what he had actually said was far more troubling than the executives realized. Richard cleared his throat. "Can we bring in another interpreter?" he asked. "There's no need," Zhang replied in English. His voice was calm, but the disappointment behind it was impossible to miss. "I have spent 6 months discussing expansion into China with your company." He paused. 6 months. Nobody interrupted. Zhang folded his hands together. Yet not one person in this room seems interested in understanding the people they claim to serve. The temperature in the room suddenly felt colder. Richard's confident smile disappeared entirely. Outside, sunlight glimmered across the Hudson River. Inside, anxiety spread across the conference table like an invisible shadow. Then Zhang spoke again, this time entirely in Mandarin. The words flowed quickly and naturally. Several executives stared blankly. Others shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. The interpreter assigned to the meeting looked completely overwhelmed. Sweat gathered near his collar. Richard glanced desperately around the room. Nobody could help him. Nobody except one person. At the back of the room, Elijah Carter slowly lowered the cleaning cloth from his hand. For years he had perfected the art of disappearing into the background. But as silence settled over the conference room and Zhang's eyes remained fixed on him, Elijah realized something uncomfortable. For the first time in a very long time, remaining invisible might no longer be an option. Elijah kept his eyes on the glass even as the weight of the room settled onto his shoulders. The cloth moved slowly across the surface, leaving behind a clean streak that reflected the skyline beyond the windows. 42 floors below, traffic flowed through Midtown Manhattan in steady lines of yellow taxis and black SUVs. Up here, however, everything had stopped. Nobody spoke. Nobody knew what would happen next. Elijah knew exactly why Zhang Guowei was looking at him, and that knowledge made his stomach tighten. He had spent years making sure moments like this never happened. Years making sure nobody asked questions. Years making sure nobody looked twice. The janitor uniform helped. People saw the badge, the cleaning cart, the work gloves, and immediately decided who he was. Most days that was easier. Most days it was safer. Richard Sterling finally pushed his chair back. The leather creaked sharply against the silence. "Does anyone know what he just said?" he asked. The interpreter opened his mouth, then closed it again. His face had turned pale. Not completely, he admitted. Richard looked as if somebody had removed the floor beneath him. Across the table, several board members exchanged worried glances. One woman tapped her pen against a legal pad. Another executive loosened his tie. The atmosphere no longer felt like a celebration. It felt like a test nobody had prepared for. Zhang remained perfectly still. His expression revealed almost nothing. Yet there was disappointment in his eyes. Not anger. Not frustration. Disappointment. Somehow that felt worse. Elijah recognized the look immediately. He had seen it years ago in lecture halls thousands of miles away. Beijing. The memory surfaced without warning. Rows of students. Bright projector screens. The smell of coffee and printed textbooks. Long nights studying international markets while snow drifted beyond campus windows. Back then, Elijah Carter had not carried a mop. He had carried notebooks filled with economic forecasts and trade analysis. Back then, professors expected him to lead multinational negotiations one day. Life had moved differently then. Life had also moved faster. A sudden voice pulled him back into the present. You understand Mandarin, do you not? Zhang asked. The question came in Mandarin itself. Smooth, direct, unmistakable. Every executive in the room looked confused. Elijah froze. For a brief second, nobody understood that the billionaire had spoken directly to him. Nobody except Elijah. He lowered his eyes. The cloth stopped moving. A faint reflection of his face stared back at him from the polished glass. Richard followed Zhang's gaze again. Slowly, realization began forming. Across his features. Wait, he said. Are you speaking to him? Nobody answered immediately. Sunlight spilled across the conference table, illuminating stacks of contracts and untouched glasses of water. The room suddenly felt smaller, tighter. The interpreter looked relieved that attention had shifted elsewhere. Several executives turned completely in their chairs to stare at Elijah. One of them frowned as if trying to remember whether he had ever seen the janitor before. The truth was that most of them had not. Not really. They had passed him in hallways, shared elevators with him, walked by him every morning. Yet none of them had actually seen him. Zhang spoke again, still using Mandarin. This time his voice carried the patience of a man waiting for an answer he already expected. Elijah closed his eyes briefly. He could feel every gaze in the room, every assumption, every expectation. Then he slowly set the microfiber cloth on top of the cleaning cart and turned toward the conference table for the first time. The room watched him as if he had suddenly become someone else. Elijah could feel it in the silence. A minute earlier he had been invisible. Just another employee moving quietly through the background. Now every executive at the table was staring directly at him. Richard Sterling stood beside his chair, confusion and urgency competing across his face. The deal was slipping through his fingers, and for the first time since the meeting began, he did not appear to have control of the situation. Elijah inhaled slowly. The scent of polished wood and fresh coffee lingered in the air. Beyond the windows, late afternoon sunlight reflected off neighboring skyscrapers, turning the glass walls into sheets of gold. Zhang Guowei remained seated, his eyes steady and patient. He repeated the question in Mandarin. This time there was no misunderstanding, no uncertainty. The question was meant for Elijah alone. Several executives looked toward the interpreter. The interpreter looked toward the floor. Nobody knew what was being said. Richard finally broke the silence. Can somebody tell me what is happening? He asked. Elijah glanced briefly toward Zhang. Then, after a long pause, he answered in Mandarin. His voice was calm and measured. The words flowed naturally, carrying the rhythm of someone who had spoken the language for years. The reaction was immediate. Zhang's expression changed first. The disappointment disappeared. In its place came genuine surprise. Then came something else. Respect. The billionaire leaned back slightly in his chair and answered with another sentence, longer this time, more complex. Elijah responded without hesitation. The exchange lasted only seconds, yet it felt much longer to everyone watching. Around the conference table, confusion deepened. One executive nearly dropped his pen. Another sat frozen with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. Richard stared openly now. What did he just say? He asked. Elijah turned toward him. Mr. Zhang asked whether anyone in this company truly understands the Chinese market beyond numbers and presentations. Richard blinked. And your answer? Elijah hesitated. The room seemed to tighten again. I told him understanding people comes before understanding markets. Nobody spoke. Even Elijah seemed surprised by his own words. They had come out naturally. Honest. Simple. Zhang nodded slowly. Exactly, he said in English. His accent was noticeable, but clear. For 6 months I have listened to forecasts, charts, and strategies. Nobody spoke about people. The billionaire folded his hands together. Except him. Every eye shifted back to Elijah. Heat crept into the back of his neck. Attention still felt uncomfortable after all these years. Richard looked between the two men. You speak Mandarin fluently? The question sounded almost impossible to him. Elijah offered a small nod. Yes, sir. Where did you learn? Richard asked. The room waited. Elijah glanced toward the city beyond the windows. For a moment, memories surfaced again. Snow-covered university pathways. Crowded Beijing streets glowing beneath red lanterns. Long evenings studying international trade while classmates debated economic policy deep into the night. Another life. Another version of himself. I spent several years in China, Elijah said quietly. That answer only created more questions. Several. Executives exchanged looks. One woman opened a notebook and began writing something down. Richard stared as if trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly appeared in front of him. How could a janitor speak flawless Mandarin? Why had nobody known? And why did one of the most influential investors in the world suddenly seem more interested in the man with the cleaning cart than the executives leading the company? Zhang looked at Elijah once more. Then he smiled faintly. It was the first smile anyone had seen from him all afternoon. Interesting, he said. Very interesting. The smile on Zhang Guowei's face lasted only a moment, but it changed the atmosphere of the entire room. Tension still lingered around the conference table, yet something new had entered the space. Curiosity. The billionaire's attention remained fixed on Elijah, and that fact alone unsettled several executives. Richard Sterling slowly sat down again. His fingers tapped once against the polished table before becoming still. He was a man accustomed to leading conversations, directing outcomes, and controlling negotiations. Yet the center of gravity had shifted away from him. Everyone could feel it. Zhang adjusted the sleeve of his charcoal jacket and spoke in Mandarin once more. The words came faster this time, carrying the cadence of a personal conversation rather than a business exchange. Elijah listened carefully. A flicker of surprise crossed his face. Then he answered. Their dialogue continued for nearly a minute. The executives watched helplessly as the two men exchanged thoughts they could not understand. Some glanced toward the interpreter, hoping for assistance. The interpreter simply stared at his notes. Finally, Richard raised a hand. Would somebody please tell us what is being said? Elijah turned politely toward the table. Mr. Zhang is asking where I studied. Richard blinked. And Elijah hesitated. I attended Tsinghua University in Beijing. Silence followed. A board member actually laughed once before realizing Elijah was serious. The laughter died immediately. Richard stared at him. You attended Tsinghua? Elijah nodded. Several people around the table recognized the name. Instantly, one executive quietly muttered, that is one of the top universities in the world. Nobody corrected him. Nobody needed to. The realization settled heavily across the room. Richard looked at the janitor uniform, then back at Elijah's face, as though the two images refused to fit together. What did you study? He asked. International business and market strategy, Elijah replied. The answer landed harder than anyone expected. Sunlight continued spilling across the conference room floor, illuminating the wheels of the cleaning cart parked beside the glass wall. The contrast felt impossible to ignore. An employee who cleaned floors discussing international markets. A billionaire speaking to him as an equal. None of it matched the assumptions everyone had made only minutes earlier. Zhang leaned forward slightly. Tell them the rest, he said. Elijah lowered his eyes. There is not much else to tell. I disagree, Zhang replied. The billionaire folded his hands together and looked directly at Richard. The reason your company struggles to connect with Asian consumers is because you only see titles. Nobody moved. Zhang's voice remained calm, but every word carried weight. You listen to executives because they sit at this table. You ignore people because they wear different uniforms. Richard's jaw tightened. Nobody dared interrupt. Outside the windows, clouds drifted slowly above the city. Inside, the room felt completely still. Zhang turned back toward Elijah. Years ago, he said, I met many talented students in Beijing. Most wanted status. Most wanted money. Very few wanted understanding. His eyes narrowed thoughtfully. You were one of the few who understood people first. Elijah looked genuinely uncomfortable. Recognition was not something he sought. In fact, it was exactly what he had spent years avoiding. Yet as dozens of eyes remained fixed on him, one uncomfortable question began forming in every mind around the table. If a man with this knowledge and education was pushing a cleaning cart through the building every night, what story had everyone failed to see? Nobody answered Zhang's question. The silence itself became the answer. Around the conference table, faces that had once carried confidence now reflected something closer to discomfort. Richard Sterling leaned back slowly, his expression tightening as pieces of a story he had never bothered to notice began falling into place. Elijah remained standing beside the cleaning cart. The gray uniform suddenly seemed less like a definition and more like a disguise everyone had accepted without question. One executive cleared his throat. If you have those credentials, he said carefully, why are you working here as a janitor? The question hung in the air. Several others nodded. It was the same question they were all thinking. Elijah looked down briefly at the pair of work gloves resting on top of the cart. The gloves showed signs of use. Worn edges. Faded fabric. Evidence of years spent doing honest work. Life changes, he said quietly. The answer sounded simple, but something in his voice suggested far more. Richard folded his hands together. What happened? He asked. Elijah hesitated. For a moment, the afternoon sunlight reflected across the conference room windows and illuminated tiny particles floating through the air. The city outside continued moving at full speed, unaware that an entirely different kind of negotiation was unfolding 42 floors above the street. After graduate school, I worked in international consulting, Elijah said. Most of my clients were expanding into Asian markets. Several executives exchanged surprised looks. The story was already more impressive than they had expected. Then my mother became ill. Elijah's voice remained calm. She needed full-time care. There was nobody else. The room grew quieter. I left my position and returned home. Nobody interrupted. When she passed away, several years had already gone by. The industry had moved forward. Opportunities became harder to find. He shrugged slightly. Bills still needed to be paid. The explanation contained no bitterness, no resentment, only facts. Somehow that made it even harder to hear. Zhang watched him carefully. You never mentioned your accomplishments when we first met, the billionaire said. Elijah looked surprised. Because they were not important. Several executives frowned in confusion. Zhang smiled faintly. That is exactly why I remembered you. Richard glanced sharply toward the billionaire. You have met before? For the first time, genuine curiosity appeared across the room. Zhang nodded. Several years ago. He leaned back thoughtfully. I was visiting Beijing during a university leadership conference. Elijah immediately looked uncomfortable. Mr. Zhang, the story matters, Zhang replied. Richard sat forward. Every executive at the table followed closely now. Zhang's eyes drifted briefly toward the skyline before returning to Elijah. Many students wanted photographs. Many wanted introductions. Many wanted favors. His voice remained steady. One student stayed behind after the event ended because he noticed one of my assistants was struggling to organize transportation for several international guests. The billionaire smiled slightly. He spent 3 hours helping complete the work. Then he left without asking for anything in return. Nobody spoke. The room had become completely still. Richard slowly turned toward Elijah. The janitor uniform no longer looked the same. The cleaning cart no longer looked the same. Everything people thought they understood had begun to shift. And as the realization spread across the conference table, another uncomfortable truth emerged alongside it. The company had spent years searching the world for people who understood international relationships, cultural trust, and human connection. The entire time, one of those people had been walking their hallways every single day. The conference room fell into a rare kind of silence. Not the silence of uncertainty or tension, but the silence that arrives when people begin questioning their own assumptions. Nobody reached for a phone. Nobody checked an email. Even the stack of contracts sitting at the center of the table seemed forgotten. Afternoon light stretched across the polished surface, turning the wood a warm shade of amber. Elijah stood quietly beside the cleaning cart. The wheels remained pointed toward the hallway as though he had every intention of finishing his shift and disappearing once the meeting ended. That simple detail struck Richard more than anything else. A man who had just revealed years of international education and experience was still standing beside a mop bucket instead of demanding recognition. Richard glanced toward the windows. From this height, the city looked calm. The streets below appeared almost peaceful. Tiny streams of traffic moved through Manhattan like veins carrying life through a living machine. Yet inside the conference room, something far more important had begun moving. Perspective. Zhang Guowei folded his hands and studied Elijah for several moments. "Do you know what impressed me most back then?" he asked. Elijah lowered his eyes slightly. "I'm not sure, sir." Zhang smiled. "You listened." Several executives exchanged confused looks. The answer seemed too simple. Zhang noticed their expressions. "Most people believe influence comes from speaking," he said. "Very few understand that influence begins with listening." His gaze shifted around the table. Markets change. Technology changes. Strategies change. Human nature does not. Nobody interrupted. People want respect. People want dignity. People want to feel understood. The billionaire tapped one finger lightly against the table. That is why successful partnerships survive difficult times. Richard listened carefully. The words felt less like business advice and more like a lesson he should have learned years earlier. Elijah remained silent. The attention still made him uncomfortable. Recognition had never been his goal. Survival had been the goal. Caring for his mother had been the goal. Paying rent had been the goal. Keeping food in the refrigerator had been the goal. Life had a way of reducing grand ambitions into practical necessities. Yet despite everything he had lost, there was no bitterness in his expression, only quiet acceptance. Richard found himself studying Elijah differently now. He remembered passing him in the lobby, passing him near elevators, passing him in hallways before early meetings. The memory brought an uncomfortable realization. He could not recall ever saying good morning. He could not recall ever asking his name. The thought settled heavily in his chest. Across the room, sunlight reflected from the glass wall and illuminated the silver threads beginning to appear near Elijah's temples. They had probably been there for years. Nobody had noticed. Zhang slowly stood from his chair and walked toward the windows. The city stretched endlessly before him. "Business is not built on contracts," he said softly. "Contracts only record trust that already exists." He turned back toward the table. The problem today was never language. His eyes settled on Richard. The problem was that everyone became so focused on titles that they stopped seeing people. The words lingered in the room long after he finished speaking. Nobody argued. Nobody could. Because deep down, every person sitting at that table knew he was right. And for the first time that afternoon, Richard Sterling realized the most valuable lesson of the entire negotiation had nothing to do with the deal sitting in front of him. It had been standing quietly beside a cleaning cart all along. Richard Sterling remained seated long after Zhang finished speaking. The conference room was quiet enough to hear the faint vibration of air flowing through the ceiling vents. Nobody seemed eager to return to the contract. The numbers, projections, and financial models that had dominated the morning suddenly felt secondary. Something far more important had taken their place. Richard slowly looked toward Elijah. For the first time, he was not seeing a janitor. He was seeing a man whose story he had never bothered to learn. Yet the biggest surprise was still waiting. Zhang walked back toward the conference table and stopped beside Elijah's cleaning cart. His hand rested lightly on the handle. "There is something else they should know," he said. Elijah immediately shook his head. "That is not necessary, sir." Zhang smiled. "I believe it is." The executives leaned forward. Curiosity had completely replaced their earlier skepticism. Zhang glanced toward the windows, as though searching through memories several years old. "The conference where we met was held during one of the worst winter storms Beijing had seen that year," he began. "Flights were delayed. Transportation systems were overwhelmed. Many visitors became stranded across the city." Elijah lowered his eyes. He already knew where the story was going. Zhang continued anyway. "My daughter was studying abroad at the time. Her car became disabled during the storm. Her phone battery died. She was alone in freezing temperatures. Several people around the table exchanged concerned looks. She later told me that dozens of people passed by without stopping. Everyone was in a hurry to reach home." Zhang smiled faintly. Then a student carrying a backpack stopped and stayed with her for nearly 2 hours until help arrived. Richard slowly turned toward Elijah. The answer was becoming obvious. "You?" he asked quietly. Elijah shifted uncomfortably. "Anyone would have done the same." Zhang immediately shook his head. No, they did not. The room became still again. When my daughter offered money, he refused. When she offered professional connections, he refused those too. The billionaire looked directly at Richard. He never even told her his full name. A board member frowned. How did you find him? Zhang laughed softly. I spent months trying. Several executives smiled for the first time all afternoon. Eventually, I discovered he was the same student who had helped organize transportation after the conference. The same student who never asked for recognition. Elijah looked toward the floor. Attention still embarrassed him more than praise ever pleased him. Zhang folded his arms. When I entered this building today, I recognized him immediately. Richard felt a chill move through his chest. Suddenly, the events of the afternoon made sense. The questions, the attention, the unexpected patience. None of it had been random. Zhang had already known exactly who Elijah was. The billionaire turned toward the table. His expression grew serious once more. I came prepared to invest in a company. He paused. Instead, I discovered something more valuable. Nobody spoke. Sunlight reflected across the glass walls as the city outside began transitioning toward evening. Then Zhang looked directly at Richard and delivered the sentence that changed everything. If your company cannot recognize the value of a man like Elijah Carter, then I must question whether it truly understands value at all. The words settled over the conference room with extraordinary weight. Nobody rushed to respond. Nobody attempted to defend themselves. Outside the windows, the late afternoon sun had begun its slow descent, painting the glass towers of Manhattan in shades of gold and copper. Inside, every executive at the table seemed lost in private reflection. Richard Sterling stared at the contract in front of him without actually seeing it. Numbers no longer occupied his thoughts. Market projections no longer mattered. Instead, he kept replaying a simple truth. For years, he had measured value by resumes, titles, offices, and organizational charts. Yet one of the most capable people he had ever encountered had been working under the same roof, unnoticed. Elijah remained beside the cleaning cart. The attention still felt unfamiliar, uncomfortable. He had never sought recognition. He had simply done the work in front of him. Day after day, year after year. Richard slowly stood and walked around the conference table. Several executives watched with surprise. The chief executive rarely left his position during meetings. Yet this was no longer a normal meeting. When he finally stopped, he stood directly in front of Elijah. For a brief moment, neither man spoke. The city glowed beyond the windows. The conference room remained silent. Then Richard extended his hand. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. Nobody had expected those words. Not from him. Not here. Elijah looked genuinely surprised. There is no need, sir, he replied. Richard shook his head. There is. His voice carried none of the authority he usually projected. Only honesty. I should have known who you were long before today. More importantly, I should have taken the time to know who you are. The sincerity in his tone changed the atmosphere immediately. Several executives lowered their eyes. Others nodded slightly. They knew the apology was not just for Richard. It represented every assumption made throughout the building. Every person overlooked because of a uniform. Every conversation never started. Elijah accepted the handshake. His grip was firm but humble. We all get busy, he said. Life moves fast. Richard gave a faint smile. That sounds much kinder than I deserve. A few people quietly laughed. The tension that had dominated the room for hours finally began to ease. Zhang watched the exchange with visible approval. He folded his arms and looked around the table. Now, he said, this is the conversation I hoped to see. The billionaire returned to his seat and opened the contract once more. Trust begins here. Several executives immediately straightened in their chairs. Hope returned to the room. The negotiation was not over after all. Yet before anyone could resume discussing business, Richard turned back toward Elijah. I have a question. Elijah nodded. Yes, sir. Richard glanced around the table. Would you be willing to help us understand the market we have been trying so hard to reach? Elijah looked momentarily speechless. The room waited. The sunlight reflected softly across the polished floor. Finally, Elijah smiled. It was a small smile. Quiet. Genuine. If it helps people understand each other better, he said, I would be happy to help. At that moment, even before a single page was signed, everyone in the room sensed that something much more valuable than a business deal had already been secured. 1 week later, the atmosphere inside Sterling Dynamics felt different. Not dramatically different at first. There were no grand announcements echoing through the hallways. No banners. No celebrations. Just small changes that quietly spread through the building. Employees who had once walked past one another without acknowledgement now paused to exchange greetings. Managers spent a little more time listening. Conversations became less rushed. Somehow, the lesson from that afternoon had traveled far beyond the conference room. On the 42nd floor, sunlight streamed through the windows as another meeting came to an end. This time, however, the discussion sounded different. Questions about cultural partnerships were met with thoughtful answers. Assumptions were challenged. Perspectives were shared. Around the table sat executives, advisors, and market specialists. Among them sat Elijah Carter. He still carried the same calm demeanor, the same measured way of speaking, the same habit of listening before responding. Yet the nameplate in front of him reflected a new chapter. Director of Asia Relations. The title looked impressive, but Elijah rarely paid attention to it. He focused on the work instead. Across the room, Richard Sterling watched the meeting conclude. He often found himself reflecting on how close he had come to losing both a major partnership and an invaluable lesson. The contract with Zhang Guowei had eventually been signed. Not because of financial projections, not because of negotiation tactics. It had been signed because trust had finally entered the room. That trust continued to shape every conversation that followed. As people gathered their materials and prepared to leave, Richard approached Elijah. "The Shanghai expansion team approved your recommendations," he said. Elijah smiled. "That is good news." Richard nodded. "You know, 6 months ago I would have looked only at the numbers." Elijah glanced toward the windows overlooking Manhattan. "And now?" Richard asked. "Now you are looking at people too." Richard laughed softly. "I am trying." The office gradually emptied. Chairs rolled back beneath tables. Laptop screens went dark. The sounds of another workday slowly faded. Elijah remained for a moment, gazing out at the city. Evening sunlight painted the glass towers outside in shades of gold and amber. Thousands of lives moved through the streets below. Thousands of stories. Many visible, many unseen. The thought felt familiar. As he stepped into the hallway, he passed a storage closet near the elevators. The door stood slightly open. Inside sat an old cleaning cart. The same cart he had pushed through the building for years. Elijah paused. For a moment, memories drifted through his mind. Long nights. Quiet hallways. Empty offices. The steady rhythm of work done without recognition. He reached out and gently touched the handle. There was no sadness in the gesture. No regret. Only gratitude. Every step of the journey had brought him here. Then he let his hand fall away and continued down the corridor. The lights above reflected softly against the polished floor. Behind him, the old cart remained exactly where it was. Ahead of him, the hallway stretched toward the fading light of evening. And as Elijah walked forward, there was no need for applause, no need for speeches, and no need for anyone to explain what had happened. The quiet itself said enough. Sometimes the greatest victories are not about proving people wrong. Sometimes they are about reminding people to see what was there all along.